Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I have a question, and this is a question for the recording. Do we need to speak into the mics for the recording?
Yes, please.
We do. Okay. Because this is a small enough room that mics are technically not needed. Welcome to the Wien Museum and to the second annual Vienna Humanities Festival. My name is Matti Bunzl. I'm the director here at the Wien Museum, and it's a tremendous pleasure to welcome you all here to our festival. We are organizing it together with two wonderful partner institutions, the Institut für die Wissenschaften vom Menschen and Time to Talk, the European Discourse Network. And every year the festival, well, all of 2 years that it now exists, has had a theme. And it is modeled, this whole concept is modeled after the Chicago Humanities Festival, which has been going strong for about 30 years now. And they pioneered this format that we've literally just copied, pretty much, you know, sort of point by point. No, it's okay. I'm rather proud of that. I mean, steal from the best is my attitude. The idea there is that every year, you know, the festival defines a topic, and then it's almost, you know, thinks through this topic from any vantage point that comes to mind from the humanities, the arts, oftentimes going into social sciences, even natural sciences at times. Oftentimes the topics have a contemporary edge, something that is grounded in the here and now. Last year's topic for us, the first festival, had a lot to do with the refugee crisis. The theme that we came upon was anderen Orts, you know, out of place. It was a wonderful occasion to think about the crisis in a large, really world historical context. This year, we let ourselves be inspired not by an immediate current event, but by an anniversary. 1917, 100 years ago, as you all know, the Russian Revolution. And we thought that there would surely be a lot of events surrounding that, commemorating it. That is the case. There's also been a bunch of books published on the Russian Revolution. And we thought, well, let's take this as a starting point for a much, much wider conversation about revolution as a concept, from a philosophical perspective, an artistic perspective, and of course, a historical perspective. What happens then is the real fun of the festival, because the way the festival is structured, we essentially have 40 slots. I mean, if you look at that, this is all very structuralist. It's a grid. There are 4 events simultaneously. There are 4 venues. So once you tabulate it up, there are a lot of slots to fill. And then we sit around the table and we think, what are the topics we would really like to engage in? And this all brings me to this current event because as someone who's Austrian American, I was keenly interested in doing something on the American Revolution, which is very interestingly underexposed in Europe in very interesting ways. I'll just give an example. Some of you may have been here last night when Heinz Fischer, our esteemed former president and a scholar in his own right, talked about the 2 most important historical revolutions and readily said what most Europeans say to this question, the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution.
I was disappointed.
Yes, no, it's very interesting because I guess part of our job here is to convince you that at least a 3rd revolution should be added to that. The American Revolution was in many ways more radical, more wide-reaching, more destructive in some ways also, but certainly something that we need to consider in the context of our festival. Now, all this was already the case, and then a colleague told me, and this was like, one of those moments where you're like, oh my God, I can't believe this, that there is a young scholar who is writing a dissertation, not just on the American Revolution, there are lots of those. I mean, the American Revolution has been written about since the American Revolution, but on the American Revolution and Austria. Specifically, the way the American Revolution, as it happened, it was world news of the day, what was made of it here in Vienna by the Habsburgs, by the elites, and by everybody, not just Vienna, the entire monarchy. And when I heard that there is this research being done, which is really path-breaking research that, I mean, maybe because you said yesterday I'm like the ideal reader for it as an Austrian American. That may be so, but I'm also here to say it's extraordinarily fascinating. So Jon Singerton, who is finishing this dissertation at the University of Edinburgh right now, agreed to join us to share with us this marvelous work and to enlighten us about,
I hope.
Well, I have no doubt about what, say, Maria Theresia or Joseph II and folks like that thought when all of a sudden the colonies in the U.S. decided to go rogue. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
We'll have a discussion. At some point, we'll open it up for questions from the audience. But let's start by, now you have to be the American historian. I mean, some folks here know quite a bit, but others might know less. What is the American Revolution, since some Europeans don't readily know?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I just want to say thanks for being 1/40th of this of this presentation and of this this great exhibition. Yeah, so to begin with, the American Revolution, not specifically well known here in Europe as it is over in America. Americans, of course, learn this in school, they learn this throughout their entire careers. It's their kind of founding credo, right? It's everything that they turn back to. Whenever you have a great moment of political crisis, which you might have nowadays in America, they look back to the Revolution. And for historians, it's very good, because that means work is on the up, that there's more people interested in the revolution and more people reading. But to the question, what is the revolution exactly? Well, simply put, it starts off about taxes. As most things go in the world, it's about money. They don't want to pay taxes without any representation in the British Parliament, because unlike people living in Britain who pay their taxes, they don't get any say in what it goes to, how much they pay, and they're being exploited in a certain sense. And this is a thing that occurs across the whole of the British Empire at that time. So it's not just in America, but it's particularly acute in America because they make the Americans, the British make the Americans, pay more heavily than most. And the reason for that is that you have to wind the clock back to the 1750s, the 1760s, when you had a thing called the 7 Years' War, which I'm imagining is a little bit more familiar to most people here. Of course, the great European war between Austria and Prussia, as well as France and Britain, but it greatly affected things in North America. The French actually lost quite a lot of their territory in North America, and this enabled then the British to kind of really take over control of it. But that cost a lot of money. So what did the British have as a solution? We'll make the Americans pay for it. So again, roll on this clock where taxes are going up and up and up, and you eventually get to a point where it's a powder keg situation, and the final kind of tax without representation pushes things over. And from that point then on, you get clashes between the British authorities and very rowdy people, let's say in Boston, over, as we all know, tea, the final tea tax, where they wouldn't accept things being imported to them, and they threw it into the Boston Harbor. So things kick off mainly as a kind of tax revolt, in a sense. The American Revolution is also then, in a way, not just this tax revolt, this idea of rebellion without, in terms of trying to get more representation, but it's about also American freedom. There's an idea then that they are distinct, and that's also what historians try to split between the War of American Independence, where America fought for its own rights, and then the idea of a revolution where people became American and America became its own idea. Right? So it's a very different process. And in some ways, the American Revolution lasts much longer than the war, which was between 1775 and 1783, and went on until 1800 or so, creating this new American state and this republic state.
I want to unpack a lot of these things. I mean, it's all really important stuff. But can you try to take us into that society? Because, American society, mid-18th century, it is, of course, a colonial society in the sense that it is Europeans or descendants of Europeans who go somewhere else in the world to, depending on your rubric, exploit, make a good life, etc. But it is different, say, from other colonial situations, say, in Africa or in India, from the British. What is colonial society like? What is America at that point? I mean, it's...
Yeah, well, it depends. I mean, what we think of now as America is, at that point, 13 colonies within about 25 colonies in North America. So it's a small proportion, and they vary.
And why are there different colonies? Why isn't there just one British colony?
It's administrative units. So some of them, in a sense, were founded in different ways. Virginia, as we all know, is kind of the first part of America where the British settle, at Roanoke and then Jamestown. Some of them were founded, like Georgia, by kind of private investors, and there's some that are taken over, such as New York, which of course used to be New Amsterdam. So the colonies evolve in a very different way from each other. But something in common before the revolution is they all think of themselves as Englishmen, right? They're not Americans. They're not distinct in a certain sense. They're just English people who happen to live in North America. But again, they have differences between themselves. And if you want to really immerse yourself, imagine how it is to be in Boston, right? A thriving dock, essentially, right? One of the major ports of the world. All these people coming in from everywhere. Trade is the real heart of that city. You go to somewhere like Charleston, who, a small, much smaller port
in the South.
In South Carolina. It's absolutely different because there the main commodity, of course, isn't the goods from the empire, but rather slaves, okay, and sugar and indigo, okay, these slave crops. And of course, if you go outside of the city, you'll have all of the slave plantations around there. So these colonies really vary drastically from each other. And then that also affects things across the whole entire social scale. So if you're a merchant in Boston, you might be one of the most elite in the city, whereas if you're in Virginia, you will be a planter. You will be a person like George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, who all owned slaves and who all had large plantations. And they were a sort of aristocracy transplanted from Britain in that sense, right? Most people, of course, didn't come willingly, or some people came out of desperation, such as indentured servitude, where they had to pay their way to get across to America with their labor. They would sign a contract and work for 7 years after they'd arrived in the colonies.
That's so fascinating. Again, so we are all oriented to also the geography. So 13 of these colonies become the original states. So this is, the northernmost is Maine, right?
Maine not quite existing at the time, but Massachusetts.
Massachusetts.
Vermont.
So that's the New England part. And it goes all the way down to Georgia. Georgia is the southernmost. And it's essentially the states that we still have on the east coast of the US.
Essentially, yes. Yeah.
Okay. You mentioned there are 25 colonies all in all. What are some of the other colonies?
I believe it's 25 or 27. I can't quite remember.
But give us a sense of what other colonies exist, say, in 1750.
Exactly. So you would have the Caribbean, which is, the islands which, if you've all seen the news recently with the hurricanes, the British Virgin Islands, for example, got hit. They were colonies then. They're still, in a sense, part of Britain today. So in the Caribbean, you'd have, of course, the crown jewel there was Jamaica. And in many ways, the Caribbean is some of the main parts of the British Empire at that time, right? They have some possessions out in India that the East India Company have slowly eroded away from the Mughals and have taken for the British. But it's really North America focused towards the Caribbean, right? That's where the slaves all are going and working on plantations. You have much higher ratio of slaves to white people on these islands in the Caribbean than you do even in South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia. So that is the kind of difference there. The mainland colonies are the kind of industrious, more spread out, but these are the really concentrated engines of empire almost, in the sense of they produce the goods, the sugar, the rum, all of these things to be sold back in Europe and make the money.
There are some American historians, early American historians, who argue that especially the southern colonies in what becomes the United States were essentially just a kind of add-on to the Caribbean economy, that in some ways that they were a part of it. But there are colonies north as well, right, in what is now Canada.
Exactly, yeah. So, I mean, this is taken over from the French, and there's a slight problem there because, of course, they're Catholic, whereas the rest of the colonies, if we all think of the Mayflower, the Puritans, there's a rather disconnect between those two. And this is one of the things that egged on the Americans towards revolution, was the idea that the Catholics in the north are given this leniency and that they are going to become also more predominant. There's this split between, say, the Protestant, 13 colonies and the Catholic, what later becomes Canada.
That leads me to the next question. So is it this religious commonality that gets them to make common cause? Because, I mean, these being separate entities and being 13 among 25 or 27, why didn't the U.S. become all 27?
Yeah, I think in a sense, one thing you all have to understand and take away from it is that different people, you know, it's like every conflict. Every person fights for their own particular cause. And Americans / you know, Englishmen in North America at this time were no different, right? They all fought for their own reasons, right? You might have economic reasons predominate in, say, Boston and Massachusetts, in New York, but you have southern planters who really don't care what's going on in the north. It's fine that you know, they pay more tax up there. It doesn't matter that they threw tea into the river or the harbour. You know, it doesn't matter. It matters only what goes on in their locality, and it's only when something happens to them and their livelihood is threatened that they really come together in that sense. And the British, in that regard, do a rather terrible job. You know, we send the army down to the south in an attempt thinking that that's where the loyalty will be and that's where we can get more support and win this war. And it goes horribly wrong, because then, you know, you're burning farms, you're ruining people's lives, and they really don't want that, understandably. So they come on to, you know, this common cause in remarkably different ways depending on where they are.
Very interesting. So the idea of America is very much a non-British in a way.
Yes, in some degree. Yeah.
And who are the key figures in all this? Who are the forgers of America? Mm-hmm. Who invents America in the modern sense?
Well, I'm sure if we asked the audience, you would all shout out quite a few common names. I'm sure George Washington, the leader of the Continental Army, is familiar to you all. Thomas Jefferson for his famous drafting, or being one of the main drafters of the Declaration of Independence. You also have some more unknown figures that I'm rather fond of. So I think it's important to recognize John Dickinson, for example. He was a Pennsylvania, kind of lawyer who was in the Continental Congress. This Congress, again, being assembled by the colonies to sort out what's going on. Right? So before they became independent, they just had this governing system, say, to address these grievances, to come together and say, what do we want to say to the king? And write all of these things together. And one of the key people in this is John Dickinson, this rather unheard of man, who was known at the time as the pen man of the Revolution, because he wrote most of these petitions and documents that really, you know, forged then that idea of them being in it together. And of course you have people then like Benjamin Franklin, who also said those kind of phrases, and much more famous than in Europe, not only because of his scientific fame, but also because he was one of the major diplomats then who went to Paris, secured the French treaty, and brought France into the war, and then slowly the rest, such as Spain and then later the Netherlands. So Franklin himself is also a very important diplomatic figure.
I mean, yeah. You're leading me to the next big question, which is a classic. No. These are all, to me, I mean, it's fascinating stuff. France and French ideas, mm-hmm. Enlightenment. So a lot of Americans like to tell themselves, and I guess I'm kind of one of them, that the American Revolution, in some ways, is the purest articulation of Enlightenment ideas. I mean, I want to know whether you think that's true, but also what does that mean? What does it mean to say that?
Well, there's a certain sense of, what the revolution is for, what it's doing, and then this idea that gets swept up within it, the idea of there being a republic. And my sense is that in certain ways, the Americans didn't quite know what they were doing. You know, they were in a certain way. That
hasn't necessarily changed.
In a certain way, they were rather pushed into this, right? Okay. They tried first to simply readdress the problems and say to the British government, we can't do with this tax, we can't do with this system. And that goes on deaf ears because, of course, the government doesn't care. So then they go to the king and they think, well, the king is the ultimate authority, King George III. Right? He's the one who can control Parliament. We'll go to him, he's the best. And he throws out their olive branch treaty, right? The idea of, look, we will stop all of this, but we appeal to you and your power to address these problems. We are your subjects, we are the people that you are sworn to protect, right? It is your duty to protect. And it doesn't work, right? So when that happens, there's this kind of shock for many of them. John Dickinson, for example, very, very shocked that this happened. And then I think it becomes a reality of, okay, what are they going to do? There's a sense of the war is escalating. There's people fighting now against the British all over. It's a real revolt and then becoming a revolution in that sense. And the radical thing about it is then what they want to do after that, right? That they don't install their own king. They don't.
What did they think about it? I mean,
the idea of
having an American king, George Washington.
You know, there's a debate that stretches in the 1780s and 90s, especially when you have the Constitution, for example. How much power do you give the executive authority, right? So we have the president nowadays, right? There's a huge debate in 1787, the Constitution, when this is brought in, about how much power the president has. Some really did fear that George Washington could become something like King George, you know. Federalists, there's two parties that emerge, and the one are the Federalists who want a strong central government. They are lauded at because, laughed at because of, you know, thinking that they are more monarchists. John Adams, for example, who became the second president in the United States, he wanted titles because many, you know, European courts had titles for their ambassadors, for their leaders, you know, their rulers, and so the Americans, he thought, also needed something, right? When they're on the world stage, they need a title, right? Your His Excellency and so on like this. And for Washington, he came up with many, right? And some of them, the Americans in Congress, the more Republicans, thought this is madness. This is just like a king. They have their own chivalry order, you know, the Order of Cincinnati, just like the Order of the Garter in the UK. And again, some of the Republicans thought this is just like monarchy. This is a republic in monarchical clothing.
And how come the Republicans win? I mean, because if there is this debate, I mean, why did it go? Because by the time we get to the Constitution, or even the Declaration of Independence, it is government by the people for the people, which, I mean, in the 18th, I mean, this is long before the French Revolution, is as radical as it gets.
Yeah, and in some ways, you have many things on this point. So, first of all, I mean, they do lose in some ways, right? So the order in Cincinnati still exists. You know, Alexander Hamilton, some of these famous figures were all part of that. Washington, you know, all of the old military people were part of that. So in some ways, they didn't quite win. And the reason in that sense is because there was compromise. The Constitution as it is a big compromise. You know, James Madison is this famous figure who came up with kind of this third way. But you know, you had struggles about how much power the executive would have and how much power the Congress would have before that, and neither side particularly won in that sense. So it's hard to say if, you know, the Republicans actually did win in that certain sense. They certainly had their own moment in 1800 when when Jefferson becomes the president. But ironically, in some ways, and this is, you know, some great research being done on Jefferson, especially as a kind of leader figure and a president, he overstepped the mark more than Washington and Adams did. So as first as Secretary of State, the Foreign Secretary, but then also as President, he abused more of his kind of powers, let's say, as you know, especially in terms of going to war, because the Americans fought their first war after the revolution with Morocco, and it was under Jefferson's presidency that this happened. So the war kind of powers were really tested for the first time under Jefferson and a Republican, and in a certain sense have set up that precedent until today. But yeah, weren't quite in line.
How important is the Declaration of Independence? Because I mean, again, being a sort of American by choice, I guess, is what I am. I mean, we're always told, like, I mean, in citizenship, you know, applications, you have to know the Declaration of Independence, 1776.
Exactly.
Is it as important as a historian? Because it's. I mean, I think, you know, children are presented with it as the founding document of the country.
Certainly. I mean, it is one of the founding documents, without a doubt. I mean, if you go to the...
And Jefferson writes it, right?
Jefferson drafts it. So in Congress, there's a sly thing that happens. So you know, there's still some people who don't want to go independent. They don't think they need to go down that road. Once they declare themselves independent, they can't go back. And then there's the other side that are, you know, Adams and Franklin, who think that, well, you know, we've been declared outlaws by the king. We have nothing to lose. We might as well. So they set up a committee. There's a proposal for a committee to be founded so that they can write this. And that's the sly trick, is because, you know, if you have this ready, then if you go independent, then you have something. Okay. You know, so it's a step towards it. So it's a very important thing in that regard. So Jefferson drafts it because he's on that committee and he drafts most of it. Franklin makes some minor changes. But back to the point about how important it is. As I said, it is one of the most, you know, important documents there is. It is the kind of birth certificate almost of America. What it does...
It has a famous first line.
Exactly.
Do you remember it? I can't say it by heart.
Audience.
You're here for this. Oh wait.
We hold these truths to
Be self-evident.
And now that's the point that rules out becoming king, to my opinion.
That's what I'm getting at. It seems quite definitive.
Yeah, so the thing that it does...
Did everyone hear? Maybe you can repeat it.
Yes, we hold these truths to be self-evident. I mean, that's the opening line of this, right? I mean, it's quite a grandiose statement, right? It's got a lot of, unnecessary language in it, let's say, at the start. The important things, in a certain sense, about it are that they declare themselves separate from Great Britain because of the king, right? Because the king has not respected their rights, and it is natural law that they do this. So in the 18th century, there's these ideas that basically, if you transgress these natural rights, these natural laws that everybody has, human rights we might call them today, then you have the right to do something about that. It gets conflated with many groups about religion, that God is basically the only arbiter in that sense. God is the only one that gives that power and so on. Nobody can take those away. So it's kind of fighting in God's name, to do this. But in a certain sense, I said the Declaration really separates themselves from Britain because of the things that the king didn't do. So there's a long list of grievances, a long list of problems that the king did not address, and that's what it really emphasizes in that sense, right? That's what the majority of the Declaration is about. We might remember the opening, right, and very well remembered. You should come on the stage as well, but it's really that part as well which is the most important, and that's the biggest part of it in a certain sense. Right? As they declare the actions of the king illegal and separate themselves. What it does, and this is why it's important, right, is it sets themselves on the world stage as an independent power. Because if you have America fighting against Britain, right, which imagine this being the USA today, which spends 800 billion on its budget of the military, right? You need resources to do that. It's an unimaginable challenge to these people living out in North America at that time to do it, right? They need every help they can get. And you're not going to get that help when all you are is a small band of rebels who are, fighting the British army, sometimes losing, sometimes killing a few British people, but it's not looking good, right? And it's not, in a sense, legal. So what the Declaration of Independence does, and this is its importance at the time, is that it sets themselves as an independent nation, where they can go to other powers and say, we are the United States of America. We, the people, have declared ourselves free. It is natural, it is just, it is lawful.
Well, this brings us to the question we're all waiting for. So here you have a new state that is self-declaring in opposition to British monarchy, based on democratic principles, for lack of a better word. So what did Maria Theresia think of that?
Well, she's an interesting one. I mean, you must all know it's the 300th anniversary of her birth this year. I mean, it's a very interesting time to actually ask this question. She, at this...
Just again, we're talking 1776. Maria Theresia dies in 1780, so she's very much...
Yeah, as I was just about to say. So she's old at this point, right? She's a remarkable woman, right? One of the most remarkable rulers in Europe, I have to say. I mean, well done, Austria, right? She has fought through all these wars, kept her reign. Her son is in control. They might disagree, but the monarchy is on a good course, right? It's stable, it's going forward, right? And then this happens. And for her, this, I think, is a problem, right? It is a worry. Because what you had earlier in her reign, in the 1750s, is that you had a war start between the French and the British, and it got confused, in a sense, with the wars in Europe between Austria and Prussia. And it ended up where they lost a very important part of their territory, Silesia, right? Schlesien, yeah, in the 7 Years' War. And she has this in the back of her mind still, and thinks in a certain sense that this can happen again, right? So the most revealing evidence and the most revealing things we see into what she thinks about it are two examples for today. The first is that she's in constant contact with her daughter, Marie Antoinette. Okay, one of her favorite daughters. She's, of course, married to the King of France. And France, in 1778, joins this war with the Americans against the British. So, of course, this comes up in their correspondence, right? What is your husband doing, in a certain sense? And she writes to Marie Antoinette and says, I think this war can only cause trouble. You know, I think this is a problem. This can only cause pain and suffering, and you should try and persuade the king to avoid this. That's essentially the message she sends there. She's worried about what this can erupt into, that somehow Austria can be dragged into this, or Prussia could be dragged into this. You know, France and Austria at this time are allied. That's the other key thing. You know, so she's really worried that
Maria Antoinette being married off.
Exactly. So she's really worried about, you know, France dragging Austria into this war, and then they're against Prussia and Britain, and they'll lose again, and they might lose more. And she's old again, right? She might not live to somehow lead them through this, right? Or her son might not be capable as her. So there's all of this worry for her. So for her, it's a huge problem. And the other sense is domestically, what she thinks about the revolution when it hits home. And it's a bigger question we can come on to perhaps, but there's lots of, you know, news about America. You know, thousands of pages in what was then the Wiener Zeitung. It was called the Wienisches Diarium, but back...
What was it called?
The Wienisches Diarium. So it was...
Diarium.
Exactly, Diarium. So it was the old name for the Wiener Zeitung, okay? This newspaper, which still exists in Austria today. They haven't sponsored you, sadly, but they
But they write really good stories about us.
Yeah, but they were, you know, they were a great paper back then, and in a sense, there is where a lot of American news comes from, right? So they have a lot of coverage of the American Revolution, and this is something that troubles Maria Theresia, because what's the biggest news going to be in 1776? The Declaration of Independence. And when this is published, it's actually published in two parts in Vienna. And the one part that, you know, has "we the people" and so on like that, they don't care. This is philosophy, you know, really? It's fine. What troubles her is when the next part comes out and they say, you know, the king did this wrong, the kid did this wrong, and we are going to revolt because of this. You know, that's not allowed. And at the similar time, you have, you know, other American sources coming in that say, you know, we are revolting because the king didn't protect us. We are revolting because we are taking the matter into our own hands. And this troubled her. So she wrote as well around that time that it would breed, and I think it's a quote, only incivility and disorder. So she really thought that domestically it would cause, you know, not riots, let's say, but it would cause this idea that if they don't do something right, the people can take control. So it was that fear of losing monarchical power, and that was what her perspective on it was.
Which is, of course, something that is heightened tremendously once the French Revolution gets underway. But you're basically saying this, it is the American Revolution that starts this kind of worry. What about Joseph II?
He's a much more interesting guy. I was looking at the portraits just out around the corner. I think all of you just go out there when you exit. Don't go down the stairs, go out the nice way. And look at these portraits, right? Because they're fantastic. You have the Huber one that was, you know, moved here recently, and you see this, you know, Joseph II in shining armor, right? I mean, he was, it's interesting also, Jefferson thought he was a warmonger, right? So Jefferson,
really?
Exactly. So Jefferson would think that that portrait was typical of him. But Joseph, when asked about the American Revolution, said, "Oh, I'm a monarch by trade. I can't comment. You know, I'm a monarch, I don't comment on the affairs of others," right? And what you have to unpack about that statement is that what he doesn't want to do is get involved. It's just like his mother, right? And he says that in the second half of that kind of quote, he says it's the business, it's the duty of all monarchs to not interfere in other monarchs' business, right? Something to that effect. So that's really a hit on the French, because he says this in around 1778, and this is the problem, right? The Austrians don't like the idea that the French are going into this war. They don't like the idea that the French are using this to weaken Britain because they were weakened by the British earlier. So they, you know, like Prussia also in some degree think this is morally wrong, right? But they do it also because they think, well, we don't want to get dragged into it as well, because we can't afford a war. Our interest is more in the East, is with Russia, with the Ottomans. That's our problems. We don't want to fight in the war with Prussia, and we don't want to have to do anything with America. Interestingly, the French also try and sell to the Austrians the idea that they are the defenders in this war, that the British started it with them, and that therefore invokes, you know, their alliance. Then the Austrians have to pay them money to help them because they're allies. Austrians don't want to do that either. So there's a real, you know, geopolitics in Joseph's mind. Now, if I can just add,
please.
The thing where you can, you know, if you're just an average historian, let's say, you might believe that, but I'm always skeptical, right? And of Joseph II, I'm completely skeptical because he's again a very enigmatic figure in some ways. And if you look at what he does, it tells you a little bit more. So Franklin, right? I mentioned Benjamin Franklin earlier, this very famous scientist. We all know him with the kite and the lightning. That was the same kind of, you know, image of Franklin in Europe at this time. They were all amazed by this guy, right? He looked like the perfect kind of guy from America, right? He wasn't this, you know, he wasn't this, you know, idiot from the colonies. He was this, you know, great Enlightenment thinker. That's what they produce, right? The New World is good as well, okay? Joseph II was just the same. When he was younger, he was actually taught the theories that Franklin produced on electricity. He got them via Italian translations. And so he'd grown up in this similar idea that Franklin was a great scientist. And in 1778, he's on a trip. He goes to France to visit his sister, Maria Antoinette. The real reason is to kind of see why they're not producing, you know, any children. But he goes on this visit, to, you know, this royal tour to Paris. And he makes up a list. You know, he has a wish list, who I want to meet. And it's a bit crazy. I mean, at one point he wants to meet Voltaire, you know, who's probably the most radical philosopher we could want to meet in 18th century Europe. But on that list is also Benjamin Franklin. Wow. And
who's the ambassador at the time?
Who's the American ambassador, right? He's arrived in Paris at the end of December 1777. He's been there for a few months. All of Europe knows that. Vienna knows that news within about a week. Actually, the newspapers here break that news, and Franklin's best friend in Vienna has no idea, right? He didn't even know. The newspapers told him, right? So that's how well-informed people are in Vienna, and that's also a fascinating story. But with Joseph in Paris, he wants to meet Franklin. And of course, his, you know, advisors say, oh, you can't do this. You can't, you know, meet this American, especially as he's the ambassador, because it will show that you know, you acknowledge him. Yeah. So how do you do this? Well, you do it informally. You do it through a third person. And they actually get a Tuscan secretary. So his brother's the ruler of this area in Italy. And they ask the secretary to set up a meeting. And would you believe it, over hot chocolate? You know, this is the great thing in the 18th century, right? I mean, it's you know, forget the coffee here in Vienna. It's hot chocolate you want, okay? So they go to meet at this Tuscan's house, okay, this Italian man's house, for hot chocolate. What happens? Well, Franklin arrives, and, you know, he's very keen to meet the emperor as well. This is a great thing, you know. The Americans are really interested in Austria. They really want, you know, yeah, well, they want the acknowledgement. They want the support, perhaps, because they've already sent people over to Vienna to try and get these things, to try and get arms and you know, goods. But importantly, this guy's in charge of Germany, because he's not just the emperor, he's the Holy Roman Emperor, right? So he controls all of what is basically Germany. And they hope that he can command, you know, the princes below him to stop giving the English German troops. And this is a problem, right? So if they can get him to stop this would be great. So Franklin's very keen to meet him. Franklin, though, doesn't get his wish. The emperor doesn't turn up. You know, we can all sigh collectively, perhaps. You know, but Franklin has stood up. I mean, if you know, it's a bit unbelievable you wouldn't stand up Benjamin Franklin, but the emperor doesn't make it. And what I discovered when again, the archives here in Vienna are just amazing, right? And there's a kind of travel diary that is kept, and it includes all the things that Joseph did. And what you see on that morning, right, if you look at the morning that they were meant to meet for hot chocolate, is you see an entry saying, yep, the British ambassador called. Oh. Oh, yeah. The British are always the evil guys in this story, right? So they knew what was going to happen as well. You know, they had spies all over Franklin's kind of group. His secretary was was a spy, a British spy. They knew what was going to happen, and they delayed the emperor, right? And by Franklin's account, he heard that the emperor did make it there, but of course several hours later, and Franklin had already gone. So they just missed each other, and that was their chance.
What do we know? I mean, Joseph II is such a fascinating and confounding figure in so many ways, because of course, you know, his belief in certain Enlightenment principles was quite radical. I mean, quite extreme even. You have emphasized this sort of geopolitical response that the Habsburgs had. Do we have a sense of what he thought intellectually?
Intellectually is much harder because, you know, what people read and what they think is different, you know, and what people do, like I said, wanting to meet Franklin for chocolate is one thing, but then what they really think about the revolution is another.
We don't know.
Joseph, in some ways, we could say, was interested in what was happening in North America, and I think he looked upon it favorably, right? He might not have said this, but it's like the French, you know, your enemy, if they're going to be weakened, you know, the enemy of your enemy is your friend, they like this as well. So for Joseph, the interesting thing about the American Revolution and the creation of the United States is money, right? And all of the merchants, you know, in the Habsburg Monarchy are really thrilled by this. Because beforehand, the colonies could only trade with the British. Now the colonies, you know, in the attempt to try and get all the guns they need and all of the you know, the resources they need, open their ports to the world. Well, this is fantastic, you know, you can go there as well, you know. And right from the start, from 1776, you have people in Trieste, in the Austrian Netherlands, which is nowadays Belgium, all writing saying, you know, we can get a lot of money from this. We need to go and take advantage of this. And they do. You know, there's all of the, well, not all of them, but a large majority of the weapons, the guns and so on like this, were supplied from the Austrian Netherlands, right? Liège at that time produced some of the best arms in the world, flooded across to America. And when you had the Spanish, the French, and the Dutch in this war as well, Austria had one of the few kind of neutral flags, right, where their ships couldn't be stopped or raided or sunk by the British because it was neutral. So they made a lot of money from this. Belgium, the Austrian Netherlands got very, very, very rich from this. And Joseph and the rest knew this, right? They all knew this. They sent their own representative there later in the 1780s to try and keep this going, right? They wanted to trade iron from Styria. They wanted to trade like textiles from Hungary, glass from Bohemia, right? The house of Thomas Jefferson, for example, his dome, he has a very famous dome. Monticello is the name of the house. His dome that he built, he has a glass dome, and it was very hard to make this. He got it from Bohemia. It was that was the best glass at the time. Right? It's a Bohemian glass dome. Right? It's trade from the Habsburg Monarchy to the US, and that was incredibly strong. So that was what really also interested Joseph and many merchants.
It's amazing. Just please go on.
One extra small little thing, right? You all know Stephansdom, the Stephansdom. If you all go to the cathedral, you are walking where a small boy was baptized in 1778. And if you're very kind to the archivist there, like I was, you can get a picture of the entry, right, the baptism entry from the Taufbuch, right? And this boy was the son of a merchant, and he was baptized with the name Benjamin Silas Arthur Schuster. And he was given those first three names because those were the names of the American ambassadors in 1778. You had Benjamin Franklin, Silas Deane, and Arthur Lee. And this little kid was named after them. And this merchant also wrote to Franklin later and said, we call him our petit American, right? Our little American, and he's doing well. And we named him after you. You know, and in the book is Franklin as the godfather. You know, he was absent, of course, but he was the godfather. So there was this huge, especially amongst the merchants, this huge idea of, we want America, we want this trade with America.
Well, that leads me to my next question. So we've covered the Habsburgs, we've covered the economic side, which is utterly fascinating, the merchant side. Are there other classes in Austrian society for whom the revolution, I mean, I guess maybe me as a kind of romantic American wants to think that, you know, American ideals inspired progressive Austrians I don't know, that would be nice. Is that
so?
I
think you could make the case for it. So there's several annoyances I have with how people forget this project, right? Forget this idea in a certain sense. One of them is that the idea of the French Revolution is the more important one. I mean, forget that for now, okay? French Revolution doesn't exist at this point. All of the people who you could call bourgeoisie, right? Or the intelligentsia in a certain degree, they were all really enthused by what was going on. They all read the papers, they all had salon discussions, right? One of the ladies of the court, right? One of Joseph's kind of close confidants, they had a weekly salon where they met and talked about the news and all these things with some of the famous generals, right, the marshals and so on like this. She was in touch with Americans, right? She was in touch with Juliana Penn, right, who was a loyalist, right, but she part of the Penn family from Pennsylvania, but they were in touch. And all of these people, so these bourgeoisie, were very much in favor of the ideas, right? And later, they become some of the constitutionalists in a certain degree, right? So you have people, Nicholas Windisch-Graetz, okay? He's great, yeah. He's one of the most, well, not famous, but he's well known amongst certain historians. He, for example, writes to Franklin. He's in touch with Jan Hegenhuis, who is the Dutch doctor who is one of Franklin's best friends, who's the doctor to Maria Theresia, who's one of the main Americans in, like American proponents in Vienna. Mm-hmm. And later, you know, he writes an essay on constitutionalism and how, you know, natural rights should be kind of put forward. And he does this in the Austrian Netherlands around the time of the revolution there in 1787, 88. So, you know, these people had like this idea, and then later it came out more, I would say.
It's totally fascinating.
And just on the idea of intellectuals, you know, Hungary is an interesting case. Okay, so there's Kassa at the time, it's now Košice in Slovakia, was one of the major kind of university centers at the time in Hungary. There were a small group of Hungarian scholars who were very interested in what was going on over in America because they saw Hungary as a kind of colony of Austria. And they thought of themselves as in a similar position. This was a long-standing thing in 18th century Hungary, right? So they wrote essays, they had ideas about what, you know, was going on between Britain and the colonies and Austria and Hungary. One of them, for example, he was a Bohemian-born person, but his name was János Zinner. He wrote books on the Americans. And he actually tried to meet the first American diplomat who came to Vienna, and when he couldn't, he wrote to Franklin and asked him for his help. And the books he wrote were, you know, these full of praise for what the Americans were doing. They described all of the kind of, you know, battles, the accounts, the virtuousness of the Americans. And the letter he sends to Franklin when he asks for this help is really revealing. If I quote it right from memory, he says something along the lines of, "I was born under a monarchy whose rule is mild, but I cannot tell you the joy when I hear the news of your great campaign out in America." And he says, "To speak the truth, I see you all as angels sent by heaven to guard and guide the human race." Wow. You know, and this is a guy in the middle of Hungary, right? An intellectual, you can say, really impressed by America. You know, very, very much impressed by what's going on there intellectually.
That's fascinating. God, I want to. We have about 10 minutes left. I do want to give you guys a chance to ask questions. Let's do that first, and then maybe you can tell us a little bit about your second book, because it's I mean, this is amazing history.
That's a more interesting story.
No, I think we're quite captivated right now. Who would like to ask a question? Yes.
Okay. So, like the whole of Vienna, I got that damn cold, and so my English is even worse than it would be otherwise. There is the point of Benjamin Franklin meeting or not meeting.
Yeah.
Joseph. You said there was the hope to get Joseph's influence on the German kings, Fürsten, ever.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure that Franklin really could think that he had real influence. I mean, of course, being acknowledged by the meeting would have opened the door to acknowledgement also by the others. But real influence on delivering troops or weapons, I don't think Franklin could think of that.
Yeah, I mean, Franklin, you're kind of half right. So Franklin personally was more against Americans going across Europe and trying to get help wherever they could. He thought this wasn't so much a good idea. He wanted Americans to focus on France. France is the major power. France is the one that will help them. And he was, you know, quite a Francophile. Like, he really liked France. You had a split then in Congress. So Franklin and his allies in Congress thought the same. There was another group in Congress who thought, no, we should go anywhere and get any help we can because we're fighting for our lives. And those people were the Lees mainly, right? The Lee family of Virginia. You probably know like Robert E. Lee, the famous Confederate. He's descended from the same family. I mentioned before earlier, Arthur Lee is one of the ambassadors, right? There's 3. Arthur Lee is one of them. This guy goes over Europe everywhere he can to get help. He goes to Spain, for example, but he's also the first American, well, not quite, there's a more interesting story there. He's the first American diplomat to come to Vienna in 1777, and he writes, yeah, nothing good. Didn't get anything here. He got I found a few letters with merchants, trying to get uniforms, for soldiers, but that was it. His older brother, William Lee, however, is named by the Congress as the first representative and to the Habsburg Monarchy, right, to the Holy Roman Empire. And he's sent then in 1778 to Vienna to try and get exactly what Franklin and the others thought might not really be possible. He's shut out of court. I mean, it's a very interesting story about what happens to him. He spends 2 months here, goes really well at the start. He's a celebrity. All of the people want to come and meet him. He's helped by the French ambassador quite a lot. And then when he doesn't get into the court, when Maria Theresia says no, Joseph's away fighting in a war, there's no chance. If Joseph were home, maybe there were a chance. I'm not too sure. We can't say. But they definitely thought they could get something from Austria. And this side of the American Congress, which really thought we should just ask everybody, send militia diplomats, right, to every court, they thought it was possible too.
So when did the first German translation of the Declaration of Independence appear in Vienna?
That's very good.
And a second question, are there political commentaries on the Declaration itself? I mean, what we would call, op-ed pieces.
Do you mean in Austria?
In Austria, yes.
Yeah. Well, the first German language one, of course, was produced at the exact time of the Dunlap publication. So when they had this declaration signed in Congress, it was official, took a moment to breathe, it was sent off to the press and then sent all over America and then, of course, to Europe as well. And, in Pennsylvania, because I remember where the declaration was made was Philadelphia, the capital, that was quite a German colony in a certain sense, right? There's the Pennsylvanian Germans, right? The Pennsylvania Dutch that we know today and so on like this. So there was a lot of German-speaking people there and a lot of German printers there. So they took the declaration straight away and printed it in German. That's not how Austria gets it. Like I said before, the Viennesche Zeitung, they get all their news really from getting either, insider gossip, let's say, from diplomats, or from cutting it from other newspapers. And the editor of the Vienna paper actually was quite interesting because he got from both sides of the English newspapers. He took the kind of pro-American one and the anti-American one. So he was a rather interesting case. The Pressburger Zeitung, the one in Bratislava, which was really for Hungary, didn't so much, and they took ones from, Leiden, which was the Dutch press, which was very popular at the time, more international than most. So they got theirs second-hand in that sense. So you have July 4th, 1976, when you get the declaration made, and it's only then, 2 months later that you get it appear in Vienna. You get news of it before that something happened, some kind of declaration happened, but it's only in the end of August, September that, the September time, around this time actually itself, you got that declaration. I think the date is around the 28th. That you got both fast. And op-eds is an interesting one. I wish there were. That would be great. On the declaration, not so much. Again, the main people producing this are people like these intellectuals in universities, right? So like the guy in Hungary. Now, an interesting case I said we didn't really mention is, this is probably about 5% of the whole story, by the way. But Jan Hegenhues, right, the friend of Franklin, he discovered photosynthesis, for example. We might know him for that. He wrote loads of essays for the people at the court because they were very interested in this. And he didn't write one on the Declaration of Independence, but he wrote one defending the American idea, right? And he wrote one saying that, it's not, as many people say, that it's all led by Franklin. It's an actually, true revolution in a sense. It's something that we should all protect, right? We should help them humanitarian style, okay? So there wasn't anything on the declaration itself, but there were op-eds, plenty of op-eds around.
There was one last question here, and then we're gonna. Oh. Oh. Okay, I saw this one first, but
we can do both quickly.
We have to do it very quickly.
Okay, I'll try.
Very quickly.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You just mentioned Germans in the colonies as well. So I was thinking this is maybe just a niche problem, but still, I mean, you just said the British people, it was a rebellion of the British against the king. But there were Germans, Italians, French, whatever,
yes,
a lot of nationalities
Polish,
in the colonies. So my question is now, was there a bit of dissent as well with this sort of British way, or were they all Britishers in the sense that they were part of the American Revolution?
Well, they were all people who were given rights by the British. That's the important thing. You know, so it doesn't really matter what your nationality is in that sense. It matters, of course, your language, who you talk to, and so on. But they were given their rights by they were protected. That's the important thing. Protected by the English Parliament. You know, from the Native Americans who were attacking them and so on like this. So that's in a nutshell the answer. Yeah.
And then letzte Frage dann.
Two points. Well, 2 points of question. One is. At the outset, the American Revolution had aspects also for an inner-American civil war. When did that character change? When did it transform itself into kind of a unified American movement without kind of this aspect of internal civil war? And the second thing is, I was fascinated by what happened 70 years later in 1848. When Kossuth was received here as a hero, they drew his pulled his carriage over Broadway and so on. So it was a fantastic, and the Habsburg emotion in the United States. And I wonder whether there's any connection to this.
So the second one was more of a comment, but the first question was when it became... I mean, there are tons of books on this, and I think the best one to read is very thick. It came out just this year, but it's Parkinson is the author, and The Common Cause. I mean, this really... Because again, the point you have to understand is that it's different for everybody. You know, it doesn't become one turning point. It's multiple turning points for multiple people. Because again, the colonies are so prosaic and so different, you know, different nationalities, but very different situations from north to south. So there's not, I wouldn't want to put my money on one point, you know, in that sense. It's an evolution rather than, it's an evolution within a revolution. That's a nice phrase, maybe, to tie the conference together.
Echo last night. We have no time, but you have to tell us briefly, you have to tease us with your second book, because it is an astonishing story.
Yeah, so I'm from this research I found a remarkable woman. In my view, she led the most interesting life, you know, not in history perhaps, but in certainly the 18th and 19th centuries. She was the daughter of the most famous scientist in the Habsburg Monarchy. She grew up in the salon cultures, the coffee house culture. She had all of the poets adore her, write love letters to her, and she threw them all away and married a count from Dubrovnik. And she became this kind of, you know, very adelige kind of figure, right, of a countess.
She was the daughter of whom?
She was the daughter of Ignaz von Born, who was the most famous mineralogist at that time. And her name was Maria, or known to some Mimi. And she, like I said, had this, you know, marriage to this count from Dubrovnik, but she fell in love at a ball, you know, at a Viennese ball, where else, with a Swiss officer. And they both ran away together to Paris in 1789. Not such a good thing to do. So from there, they flee even further across the Atlantic to Philadelphia. You know, they can't go back home. She's living a life of shame, you know, so they go to Philadelphia. He's a military engineer, right? So he thanks to their connections, gets a job to build or rebuild a lot of the forts after the American Revolution, right? This is, they say, the 1790s. So there's a lot of work for that. He rebuilds or helped rebuild West Point, for example, you know, one of the most famous forts. And she goes with him and lives along all of these forts. She gives birth in pretty much every one that they live in to their children. They have 3 in total. And they go as far as Fort Minnenack, which I know Matti knows very well, because it's on the top of Michigan, right, on the Canadian border. She's the furthest Austrian to travel into the New World that I know of, and I think anybody knows of, right? And after all of that, they return back to Philadelphia because she's miserable, okay, because she can't deal with it. And he's writing to his boss, Alexander Hamilton, saying, my wife can't stand this. Return back to Philadelphia, and he dies. So what does she do? She has 3 kids to raise. She actually takes things into her own hands and makes a school for women and it becomes one of the most famous schools for women in North America. All of the kind of major, daughters of the American revolutionaries and families go there, and she runs this very successful business, right? And her sons grow up there. One goes into the military, the other becomes a salesman. But it starts to wane at one point, and she wants to go back to Vienna. So the authorities know this, and they know she has a lot of debt, and you can't leave without paying your debt. So what they do, they throw her and her daughter into jail, and the daughter goes insane. She loses her mind. And after they save enough money, like her sons send some money, must have, she gets out of jail with her daughter and thinks, right, that's it, I'm going back to Europe. Goes back to Europe. Father died many, many years before that. Her mother dies just before she gets back to Europe, and her daughter dies on the way. Okay, they go via Hamburg, and her daughter dies on the way. And when she's back in Vienna, forget everything. She becomes the countess again, and she lives her life out in Italy for the next 20 years, and she dies in the revolution in 1830 there. And in my view, this life that goes back and forth, in so many ways, it's unheard of in a certain sense. There's nobody, I think, had such a dynamic, perilous and interesting life like that in the 18th century. And hopefully, in a few years, you will all know the name Maria von Born.
John, well, we all know your name now. This is fascinating research. I'm so glad you're doing it. Thank you for sharing it with us today.
Thank you, really. Thank you.
And thank you for coming out. I'm just so happy that you told us about this research. One short announcement. The next event here was scheduled to be with Gabriele Hauch on the 1848 revolution. Unfortunately, Gabriele is sick. So yeah, well, we could continue. But so that is kind of, there are lots of other events, as you guys know, but some of you, I suppose, might have wanted to go from one Austrian-American event to another maybe Austrian-American event. In any case, thank you, John. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of the festival.
Thanks. Thank you.